It'll push us over the edge. So I'm hoping this is rectified sooner than later.
And rail riders in the Lower Mainland still no West Coast Express, so expect those delays on your evening commute today. And let's go to Prince George. So police there have made the largest drug bust in the city's history. Now, on Wednesday, RCMP got reports of a break and enter in a home on 5th Avenue near Tabor Boulevard. It was during that search that officers found a large number of counterfeit cigarettes, and they got a search warrant for the home. So take a look at this. They ended up finding nearly 40 kilograms of illicit drugs, including what they think is fentanyl, cocaine, and methamphetamine. They also found cannabis and what appeared to be a cutting agent, along with more than $500,000 of cash. Now, police say this is an indication that Prince George is being used as a base of operations for drug trafficking, and because of that, they will be increasing enforcement in the area. And garden thieves are a concern for a group that helps grow plants and vegetables in a community garden in Richmond. Someone has been stealing their harvests and equipment at night, and gardeners at Terra Nova Community Garden say it's been getting worse.
Lately, it's escalated. They're actually taking plants, like zucchini plants, the plants themselves. So we find that to be a little bit tacky, if we want to put it that way.
It seems like there's much more of an effort to actually scope out what's here during the day and then come back and actually do some rather large excavation at night and removal of things at nighttime.
Yeah, all that effort to grow vegetables, and that's not fun. The city is looking at solutions. So Richmond's mayor says security cameras can't be installed, and that's due to privacy concerns. And lights can also affect those growing plants. And those are your headlines. I'm Benate Brach. You're watching CBC News BC. Stay right here. BC Today is up next. Enjoy the rest of your Friday.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. Hours after it looked like the rail stoppage would be short-lived, the Teamsters Union served Canadian National Railway with a 72-hour strike notice. With billions of dollars of the economy at stake, we'll look at the ongoing fight. And Sugarcane is a heartbreaking documentary that looks at the intergenerational trauma many Indigenous communities still face as they come to terms with the fallout of residential school abuse. I'm Amy Bell, in for Michelle Elliott, and this is BC Today. Thank you so much for joining us on radio, TV, and live stream. You can call us now on our top story. Do you support the union's latest action, or do you think further government intervention is required? Our number is 604-669-3733. You can also call 1-800-825-5950 or hit pound 690. You can always email us bctoday@cbc.ca. Well, just when it looked like Canada's rail stoppage was over, railway workers have served a 72-hour strike notice. Here's a quick recap. Employees at CN and CPKC were locked out on Thursday morning. Canada's Labour Minister, Steve McKinnon, had ordered binding arbitration in order to bring the potentially crippling dispute to a resolution. CN and CPKC then announced an end to the lockout. Picketing workers said they would return to work earlier this morning, but that all changed. Here is Teamsters Canada President Francois Laporte.
Well, things are moving quite rapidly. I understand that this morning our group at CN signified the 72 hours notice for a strike at CN. So we will see at CN the same scenario than the one here at CP. That's first thing. And as I said, our legal team are looking at all our options right now.
Now, the work stoppage on Canada's railways do more than just harm the 6,500 rail employees and management. Many Canadian businesses are expressing concern about upcoming supply shortages and price increases because of this labor fight. David Miao is CEO of Liberate Logistics. Here he is explaining to On the Coast host Gloria Makarenko how the work stoppage so far is already impacting the cost of goods.
It's been incredibly disruptive. Our clients have had to pivot through us, make changes to their supply chain, divert their containers, transload their containers at our facilities, and truck their containers over the road all across Canada. And as Narissa was saying, those costs are costs that the client has to bear. They're costs that ultimately affect the client's bottom line and ultimately trickle down to consumers at the end of the day. When we're already dealing with an inflationary environment, it's just adding to those pressures.
So do you support the union's latest action, or do you think further government intervention is required? Call us at 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733, pound 690 on your cell phone, and email us bctoday@cbc.ca. Joining us now is SFU Labor Studies lecturer John-Henry Harter. Good afternoon, John-Henry.
Good afternoon, Amy.
So, what do you make of this latest turn of events in this rail stoppage?
Oh, wow. Well, I think the way it's being framed by business interests is really problematic in that they're only wanting to talk about the profits of their clients who they lobby for or who they're CEOs for, when really the key issue that often is getting neglected is that the workers' concerns, the railway workers' concerns, is about health and safety. And it's about how much sleep they get, how much turnaround time there is between their shifts. And in some cases, the railway companies are trying to make it that they can move someone for 3-4 months at a time to a completely different city to shore up their labor shortage in a certain area. So we're talking about health and safety,
Right.
whereas the business interests are really just worried about their profits.
And there does seem to be at times a misconception that that money for the workers is one of the biggest problems, but it's those safety concerns that they've voiced for many years, in fact. What are some of the sticking points that we're seeing, between both sides?
And in danger of repeating myself, the sticking point really that I understand is around rest time, how long shifts are, time between shifts, all the scheduling kind of stuff. And it very much is about workers being concerned with that and CN and CPKC being concerned with their profits. And I want to clarify too, for anyone who's listening, it's easy to think that Canadian National Railway and Canadian Pacific Kansas City are Canadian entities concerned about Canadians, but they're actually for-profit corporations with shareholders, and their fiduciary responsibility is to shareholders. And that's just a legal fact.
Mhm.
Their responsibility isn't to Canadian citizens, even though they like to pretend that they're looking out for us and our economy. Their bottom line, their legal responsibility is for profits. One of the biggest shareholders of Canadian National Railway is the Bill Gates and Melinda Gates Foundation.
And that has been brought up many times.
Oh, good.
That seems to be an eye opener for a lot of people that the
It
Gates are
really is,
somehow
yeah.
involved in this, just as stockholders. I'm just going to take in a call now from Ian in the Fraser Valley. He just wants to share his thoughts. Hi, Ian. Thanks for calling into BC today.
Well, thanks for taking the call. I just wanted to make sure that folks are aware of a couple of real interesting legal issues that are coming to light from these disputes.
Sure.
The first is that in 2015, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that unions are a protected group under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, under the section providing for freedom of assembly. And as part of that freedom of assembly, they also have the protected right to strike. Now, this is an interesting dispute because the company's positions were that one of them was going to lock out and the other one was going to permit a strike to occur. But they also changed that at the last second, and both companies locked out the workers. So now you've got a situation where the company or the unions have had to take the position to both strike against the companies, as they have seen recently with the WestJet dispute in July of this year, where the WestJet mechanics would not go to arbitration. They invoked their right to strike.
Yeah.
And that resolved in a quick resolution to that dispute. So it'll be interesting to see how the courts are going to play with this, because this will wind up in court. And what the employer's rights and responsibilities are in a lockout situation. And as far as the government's use of arbitration in these matters, it would appear that no longer will have any bearing going forward.
Right.
But it will not eliminate the government's right to legislate. And it'll be very interesting to see what's going to be happening here. And as your previous speaker said, one of the big issues here is the work-rest rules.
Yes.
And it's also important to remember that several years ago, about 4 or 5 years ago, people aren't aware of the fatigue that's involved in the scheduling system and running trains. And that a survey that was done of running trades, the engineers and conductors, 70% of the respondents actually admitted to having fallen asleep on the job at one point in the previous month of operating. So that's something that really has to be addressed.
Ian, I appreciate you calling in and raising such important points. John-Henry, I saw you nodding along quite often as Ian was speaking. He did raise some very good points. What will be the role of government as we move forward?
Yeah, Ian really is hitting two really key important points, the legal ramifications and then bringing it back around to the fatigue.
Yeah.
But to talk about the legal aspects, I mean, Ian had it absolutely correct that the right to strike was held up as part of constitutional protected by Charter of Rights and Freedoms in 2015. And the case was Saskatchewan Federation of Labor versus the government of Saskatchewan. And the right to collectively bargain was upheld by the Supreme Court in 2007. So one of the interesting things is even with your viewer poll, and I don't know if we're going to hear the results live, as we're talking,
Right.
but in a lot of ways, if people are suggesting that they don't agree with the Teamsters actions, and all they did was file 72-hour strike notice,
Yeah.
so they're actually for CN. What we're really talking about is, do Canadians believe that workers have the right to strike? And we know we have the right. It's upheld by the Supreme Court of Canada. So I'm hoping a majority of your listeners support that right,
Yeah.
because really it's the only power we have to collectively withdraw our labor. And the caller also was pointing out that the the companies had exercised their right to lock their workers out, and we can't live. I don't want to live in a society where large corporations can lock workers out to force them to accept, what they think are unsafe working conditions, but we wouldn't have the right to strike. That would be such a huge power imbalance.
Exactly.
And there's already a power imbalance between workers and their employers.
Very, very true. I'd love more people to weigh on this so we can get a better judge of where people's thoughts are at the moment. So call us at 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733. You can also email bctoday@cbc.ca. We'll head out now to Kelowna and get a talk in with Jules. Hi, Jules. What are your thoughts on today?
Hi, Amy. Thanks for taking my call.
Of course.
I have a small business in Kelowna and one in Victoria. We import foodstuffs from the UK, and I find the conversation quite interesting because we're talking about power imbalance, but we're not talking about profits of the Canadian Tires or the companies that can bounce back. We're talking about the profits or lack thereof of small businesses that hire families and pay families' mortgages, and we are on our knees between the port strike some while ago. COVID has just killed us, and here we are being at the mercy of unions that basically just say, "Yep, no, we're gonna kill the country to get our point known to the government." And it's like we are the ones that suffer from this. We are the ones that suffer from air strikes and port strikes and rail strikes. We're the end user, the small people who are trying to keep our small communities going. We're on our knees. This is a much bigger problem than is being spoken about here today.
No, and I do understand that, Jules, and I appreciate your point of view. But it is a difficult situation for so many. I'll ask you, Jules. Do you support a worker's right to strike?
I support a worker's right to strike, especially when we're talking about the instance of the safety issues. Of course, that's challenging. Of course, they have to have the ability to do that.
Right.
But the government has to come to the table here, and there has to be, between governments and unions, there has to be conversations around how they can have a right to put their points forward and not be in these unsafe situations or fighting for extra dollar here or a dollar there without it affecting the end user. I mean, everybody just talks about us as the consumer. We're not the consumer. We're the people who hold our communities together, and we're on our knees. We're going to lose everything.
Thanks for bringing that up, Jules. And John-Henry, you can hear that frustration in her voice. It's a deeply personal situation for her, and it is, when we talk about the economic impact being, in the billions of dollars per day, we do sometimes forget about those business owners that are put in this position of suffering great financial loss, even though they do support the workers. Where do we find that balance, or can we find that balance of trying to support everybody?
Well, with all due respect, I didn't hear the same thing that you heard, Amy, because we have to be really clear. The Teamsters, the union that the caller seemed to be blaming for this situation, haven't gone out on strike. They were locked out by CN and CPKC. So I don't know why the caller is trying to suggest that unions are to blame for this. It was actually the corporations, and that's just a fact. And so the Teamsters force that the workers that are represented by the Teamsters who work for CN Rail are not on strike. They've served 72-hour strike notice. So if we have small business owners saying the government must intervene now, the government has to do something 72 hours before workers are actually on strike, that is not supporting workers' right to strike. And also, Amy, I know we need to get to more callers, but the idea that small businesses, medium-sized businesses, and large-sized businesses, that their voices aren't heard, that's patently false. Every strike, every time, I can't turn on a news medium without hearing the Canadian Federation of Independent Businesses saying, look at what's happening to us, look at what's happening to our members. And I think the people that aren't being focused on enough are workers. And those are workers that go to those shops that are the backbone of our communities. So yeah, I don't really agree with the caller, and I don't think that she was really supporting the workers' right to strike, because she wants an end to it before they've actually exercised their right.
And I suppose that, we definitely won't have time to get into it all today, but that sort of speaks to that greater issue of sort of a deeper misunderstanding, perhaps, on a lot of people's parts of how these situations develop and who sort of sets the ball, the ball in motion, and who sort of holds the power in certain situations. It's something that I think rings true whenever we have these disputes. A lot of just misunderstanding and at times perhaps misinformation that both sides have to work against. We do have one email that has come in. I'll just have to get to it. It's from Kate. She writes, "We need to show our solidarity with Labour. As a regular citizen of Canada, I identify with workers, not the oligarchy, the small group of corporations, entities that seem to think profits are not created by the labor of workers. Corporate profits are, in fact, stolen wages." What do you make of that?
Oh, that's just facts. No, it's true though.
Kate just laying down the facts here.
Yeah, Kate, it has it right on, and it's really well put, because once I start talking about exploitation of surplus value, I'm going to lose some of our listeners. But that's what it is. Like the heart of our community, the heart of Canada. And with all apologies to small, medium, and large-sized businesses, they're workers. Their workers are the heart of the community, and our safety and our health. You don't have any business, you don't have any profit without the working people of Canada. And the working class and working poor are the majority of Canadians, and often we're treated like some sort of special interest groups. Like, so if they're fighting for health and safety on the job, they're fighting for people, like Ian pointed out, a previous caller, for workers not to fall asleep as they're going through my community, right? When the trains are going through Maple Ridge, I want those Teamster members to be well rested. Like, for real, that's the bottom line here. I don't really care if Bill Gates makes another $1 or $1 billion on his railway investment. That's not Canadian interests. That's Bill Gates' personal financial interest.
We've got time for one more very quick call. Terry, just about out of time, but what point did you want to make quickly?
I think I wanted to make the point that I don't think we think a lot about these people who dedicate their lives to move things, all kinds of produce and economic stuff across the country. Do we think of them very often? We think of small business a lot. I know that. But I heard Gloria Makarenko interview a retired railway man the other day. It was eye-opening to me.
Incredible interview, yes.
What happens to them. And I just think, You know, I've belonged to a union all my life, and we had really, cushy stuff in our contract. I don't think these guys do. And I think they deserve more. They deserve to know when their bloody shift is going to be and how long it's going to be and if they're going to be home for Christmas, for God's sake. Anyway, that's my quick comment.
Thank you so much for that. And John-Henry, very quickly, I can see you nodding once again, your enthusiastic agreement. And I think that has been what you're trying to sum up. It is these basic rights that workers need to have and that we need them to be well rested and safe as they come through our communities.
Absolutely. And I'm loving your listeners, by the way.
I know.
Holy cow.
They're nice and feisty this week, and we thank them
sure.
for it. We're right out of
Absolutely.
time, and I wish we had more time, but I suspect we might reach out to you again in the near future.
Okay, thanks so much, Amy.
All right, take care.
You too, bye-bye.
John-Henry Harter, Labor Studies lecturer at Simon Fraser University. It is 12:27, and this is BC Today. Kamala Harris is now the Democratic Party's presidential nominee. The sitting vice president took the stage in a packed United Center in Chicago, and she touched on many topics, including the war in Gaza, the middle class, and abortion rights. But as expected, she zeroed in on the Republican Party's presidential nominee, Donald Trump.
And we know what a second Trump term would look like. It's all laid out in Project 2025, written by his closest advisors. And its sum total is to pull our country back to the past. But America, we are not going back. We are not going back. We are not going back. We are not going back to when Donald Trump tried to cut Social Security and Medicare. We are not going back to when he tried to get rid of the Affordable Care Act, when insurance companies could deny people with pre-existing conditions. We are not going to let him eliminate the Department of Education that funds our public schools. We are not going to let him end programs like Head Start that provide preschool and childcare for our children. America, we are not going back. And we are charting a new way forward.
This is BC Today on CBC. We're on Radio 1, CBC Television, and live streaming on our website, cbc.ca/BC, YouTube at CBC Vancouver. Coming up next, it is the local news with Susan McNamee.
Good afternoon. In the news, BC's Police Oversight Agency is investigating an incident that left an officer and a suspect injured. Police say they were called to assist the fire department in Richmond for a man who was allegedly setting a sign on fire last night. The RCMP say the man refused to cooperate. There was a struggle that resulted in an officer getting stabbed and the suspect getting shot by police. The officer and suspect were taken to hospital for what are believed to be serious injuries. As you've been hearing, the Teamsters Union has served Canadian National Railway with 72-hour strike notice just hours after reporting it was taking down picket lines. Yesterday, the country's two biggest rail companies locked out 9,300 workers, and the federal government said it was referring the dispute for binding arbitration. The union is expected to argue that ordering binding arbitration is unconstitutional. And Prince George RCMP say they've made the largest drug seizure in that city's history. Police say they were investigating a break-and-enter when they noticed a cache of counterfeit cigarettes. They say they obtained a search warrant, and a further search of the home turned up nearly 40 kilos of illicit drugs, including suspected fentanyl and cocaine. The RCMP also seized more than $500,000 in cash. With a brief look at the BC weather on the south coast, showers a high of 17. Saturday, rain ending near noon, then cloudy with a 30% chance of showers. For the central interior, a mix of sun and cloud, possible showers a high of 23. For the southern interior, there's a 40% chance of showers with the risk of a severe thunderstorm today, and it is windy with an expected high of 29. And up in the Peace, a mix of sun and cloud today. Tomorrow, showers, windy with a high of 16. That's a brief look at the news and weather, and I'll be back at 1 with more national, international, local news and weather too. But right now, it's back to Amy and BC Today.
Susan, it's always lovely to have you with us. Is it a special guest appearance for one day only? Or are you
One day
in
only.
long-term?
That's right. That's right. VIP, veteran, like Cher, just stepping
pop
in to
in,
do
pop out, a little
one
cameo.
more retirement tour in the rain.
I know, it feels very fall-like, but I have hope we're going to get some more sunshine before we say goodbye to summer.
You know, it was the first day where I actually went to put on shoes, and I thought, do I still wear sandals or do I have to wear
I'm
covered
wearing
shoes?
boots today, I'm sorry to
You
say.
got your boots on.
I do.
Okay, you got your Nancy Sinatra boots. Well, I went with sandals and colored the toes. I thought, no, I'm not going to let summer die. And we're getting some sun back again next week.
I'll be back in my flip-flops soon. Don't you worry.
Okay.
Thank you, Susan.
Nice talking to you. Bye-bye.
And you can hear more about today's top stories by tuning into your local CBC afternoon show. For a look at what's happening here in Metro Vancouver, it's On the Coast. Gloria Makarenko.
Hi there, Amy. It's Gloria Makarenko here, and I'd love for you to join us for On the Coast this afternoon. We'll talk about how fruit growers are still feeling the effects of the closure of the BC Tree Fruit Co-op, and this means that people are scrambling to find alternatives for packing and shipping their products. So we'll speak with a blueberry grower who just might have a solution. And you've likely heard Queen's rock anthem, We Will Rock You. Well, you've never heard it like this before. We're going to meet the local band Son of James, which has released a cover of that song using traditional Chinese instruments. Yeah, it was recorded to mark the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Exclusion Act. So join us for that and much more on the Friday edition of On the Coast between 3 and 6 this afternoon.
And an extraordinary documentary shot in and around Williams Lake, BC, is opening today in Vancouver. Sugarcane tells the story of Williams Lake First Nations investigations into missing and deceased children from the nearby St. Joseph Mission Residential School, operated by the Roman Catholic Church and the Government of Canada. The school closed in 1981 and was located on the Sugarcane First Nation near Williams Lake. Here's the trailer for that film.
I felt dirty as an Indian all my life in residential school.
Look at that. It's all names.
When you're brought up in an institution like the Catholic Church, you have strict rules, and you went with their ethics.
I've been trying to find out what happened at St. Joseph's Mission.
Everything was so secretive.
My dad was born there. How did it happen?
It's not something that you want to open up, it just keeps on damaging.
For decades, there were reports of neglect and children dying or disappearing from this facility.
2 girls drowned. Priests were moved around.
Why are they dying? Did they think we'd be stupid all of our lives, the rest of our lives, and nobody would ever find out these things?
Being sorry for something is just the first step. You have to take action.
We see the impacts in our community every single day.
We need to continue to hold each other up.
Julie and I
I ask you to open your heart. Our people are going to stand up.
Your story is someone who was abandoned, but also who abandoned.
You do know what happened with me, right?
I want to know the whole story.
I interviewed both directors yesterday. Here's more of our conversation. Sugarcane, a stunning new documentary premiering tonight in Whistler and tomorrow in Vancouver, has been winning critical praise and film festival awards from its first screening. The New York Times called it a must-see film about a terribly difficult subject, namely the unmarked graves discovered at St. Joseph's Mission, a residential school near Williams Lake. Joining me now are Julian Brave Noiscat of the Canham Lake Band Chekeskin First Nation. He co-directed with Emily Cassie, and Emily also produced and was one of the cinematographers for Sugarcane. Welcome to you both. Thanks so much for coming in, Julian.
Cook's Jam, it's good to be here.
It's wonderful to speak with both of you. Now, Sugarcane has already won multiple awards on the festival circuit, including the jury prize for directing in a documentary at this year's Sundance Film Festival. Yet, this is your first debut feature, so congratulations. Emily, you and Julian worked together at the worked together before at the Huffington Post. Why did you decide to, I guess, work together on this documentary? Emily, I'll start with you.
Thanks so much for having us here. Jules and I, we worked our first reporting jobs together almost a decade ago, and we were randomly sat at the desks next to each other and became fast friends. In the years since, I have worked as an investigative journalist and documentary filmmaker, telling stories all over the world about human rights abuses and conflicts from Rwanda to Afghanistan. And Julian, meanwhile, became an incredible writer and journalist and storyteller. And we had been trying to find something for years to collaborate on together. So when the news of unmarked graves or potential unmarked graves at the Kamloops Indian Residential School broke in May of 2021, I felt gut pulled to the story. And that's because I had covered all of these atrocities around the world, but I had never turned my camera and my lens on my own country. I'm Canadian. The last year of residential schools was my first year of kindergarten, and I had really never known very much about it. And so I texted Julian as soon as I read the news and asked him if he wanted to work on something together. And he said he'd think about it. And in the meantime, I went looking for a nation that said they were going to do a search. And I came across an article in the Williams Lake Tribune about Chief Willie Sellers and the Williams Lake First Nation. And I sent Chief Willie an email that day, and he called me back that same afternoon. And he said to me, the creators always had great timing. Just yesterday, our council said we need someone to document this search. So I was all set to go 2 weeks later, and that's when I heard back from Julian, and I'll let him finish.
So when I called Em back to tell her that I'd be open to collaborating on that documentary, that's when Em told me that she'd identified a First Nation that was leading a search, and that search was happening at St. Joseph's Mission. And as you might imagine, I just about fell out of my chair. Right. And then I said, that's crazy. Did you know that's the school that my family was sent to and where my father was born? So out of 139 Indian residential schools in Canada, Em chose the one school without knowing it, that my family was taken away to and where my father's life began.
And I mean, it's incredible. You know, and there's something there about, you know, timing, you know, it being meant to be. But Julian, your family has been deeply impacted by the residential schools, and that's your grandmother and your father, but of course that's you. How did you feel about approaching this story from such a personal lens?
Well, you know, the reason why I was in part hesitant to take on a documentary on this subject at all, not even just about St. Joseph's Mission, was that I knew my family's connection to Indian residential schools was a deep and painful one. I didn't know what the story was, and I'd always been curious about it, to be honest with you. I grew up outside of Canham Lake, the res that my family comes from. I'd returned there many times in my life. I learned Sequat Mukhchin, our language, from my Kia, who was a survivor of St. Joseph's Mission. And on a few occasions, I'd worked up the courage to ask her about St. Joseph's, and she barely told me anything about her experiences there, which said a lot, you know? And so I always had these questions, and I'd also heard when I got older that my father was born at St. Joseph's. And when we started working on this documentary, I moved in with him at the ripe age of 28 as a filmmaker, and we lived across the hallway from each other. I didn't grow up with him as a little kid. We were kind of estranged. And it became very clear that he had these questions that if he couldn't get answers for, he at least wanted the opportunity to ask them. And here I was, a filmmaker, a journalist, a writer who had the opportunity to help him and help us do that. And so, long story short, we decided to embark on this journey, and it was one that was laid before us because of Em happening to choose to make a documentary on this subject at St. Joseph's Mission.
Emily, we see in the documentary, Julian, you and your father, working to build that relationship and have that trust in each other, and it's incredibly personal. Emily, how did you feel sort of bearing witness and watching that and documenting that and just sort of letting it tell its own story? What was that like, knowing that you have such a close friendship with Julian?
Yeah, it was an extraordinary experience. I mean, I knew Julian really in the context as a coworker and really didn't know much about his family or his personal life. And Julian didn't really become part of the story until about a year in. We had filmed bits and pieces of him, but he didn't really choose to pursue that path with his dad until we had really built the trust between us, and he had really decided that this was something he wanted to do. And so I watched them together from the beginning. Ed in the very beginning was very reluctant about the story. He said, you see this in the film, he says, well, the shape of the roads, I can't go down there because of the shape of the roads, or go up there rather. And over time, the trust that they built between each other and the camaraderie and love and friendship was kind of extraordinary to witness. I had known that Julian had struggled with his dad's abandonment for much of his life, and that came from somewhere, that Ed too had gone through something that had put him in the position to struggle with those same kind of questions of parenting and trauma and addiction. And so when they finally decided to go on this kind of epic road trip together, we were packed into the car and spent weeks. We had this amazing time. And at the same time, they had these heart-rendering and wrenching conversations and decided to be extremely vulnerable, not just with one another, but in front of the camera. And that was an extraordinary thing to witness, two men being so vulnerable with each other and deciding and choosing to overcome and break cycles of pain and trauma.
And Julian, we see that journey with your father, and we see that deep connection that you have with your grandmother. And there's a scene where she is such a, to me, typical grandmother. You guys are looking at photos. There's love, there's joking, and then she alludes to the things that she's experienced that she probably should have talked about. And you ask her what, and she doesn't say anything. She gives you a look that clearly shows that she's not going to speak on it. But it sat with me because there is a generation that went through so much trauma that has impacted their children and their children's children. They are still not able to talk about it. And in this documentary, you allowed that to happen. You allowed that silence. How does that impact you?
Well, firstly, I think that that was something that we really wanted to portray in this documentary. You know, when the initial discovery of unmarked graves at the Kamloops Indian Residential School, which, by the way, was also a school that my cat attended. It's where she finished high school and studied nursing. It's the closest school south of St. Joseph's Mission. You know, because there was this refrain in the media about you know, First Nations people having known all along and nobody having listened. When I heard that, you know, I felt like that didn't ring true to my experience. My experience was one where my family was deeply impacted by this thing and we had never talked about it. We'd never really addressed it. And I think that what you see in Sugarcane is a microcosm of what happened in Indigenous communities all across North America, which is that when the spirits, and I do think that's the right way of describing this, when the spirits of the missing came home, and the memories and this moment of truth being unearthed, you know, that was a moment where we were forced in our own ways to reckon with this history and what it had not only what had happened to us, but also what that did within our own community and family context, because that's another really important part of the story. It's not just the atrocities that happen to children and families at Indian residential schools, it's also the cycles that those created in our own families and communities. And there's a real need for truth and reconciliation in that context as well.
Emily, how did you approach it as the cinematographer? There's so much striking beauty. And again, it's being allowed to sit with that silence. There's no sort of swelling music. There's not a distinct narrator guiding the viewer through what they're seeing and what they should be experiencing. You leave a lot open to, I guess, interpretation, but just that impact of what it really is. How did you approach the sort of making of this and how you wanted it to be taken in by the viewers?
Well, I first of all had the enormous pleasure of also having a creative partner in Chris Lamarca, who I shot the film with, and you know, together kind of built this language, this cinematic language that was at once epic and intimate, where, you know, as Jules spoke to, that idea of the silences permeating these communities created space and patience to really let things play out. I think the thing that's so special about verite filmmaking is that you're living the story with the characters who are leading it. And we wanted it to feel, all of us, that this past was very present. It wasn't a story about recounting a history. It was a story of how, in this moment of the truth, an excavation of the truth, both below the ground and above it, a reckoning is occurring, a stirring within the lives of our characters. And so Jules and I worked a lot on incorporating ideas about what this world was and is for Native people. So Jules would say something like, you know, this is a post-apocalyptic world. The apocalypse being colonialism. And so, okay, well, how do I portray that visually? How do we portray that visually? How do we show the starkness of the burn of the trees? You know, something else Julian would say is, you know, this is a community living on the edge of death. Well, what does that look like? You know, it looks like Julian attending 10 funerals during the making of this film. It looks like addiction and suicide wreaking havoc in these communities because of the direct effects of these schools. And so it meant me getting down 6 feet in a grave with Chief Willie Sellers and hearing that sound of the shovel as close as I could get to the feeling of burying members of your community. And I think one thing that was really interesting about how we decided to approach the cinematography is that we shot mostly on prime lenses, and a prime lens, you can't zoom. And so what that means is you have to physically move your body to be close. And so you actually have to earn the intimacy and trust to be that close to people. And I think that was essential in the storytelling and in the way we blended the intimate with the iconographies of faith and indigeneity.
And you cover sort of many different layers to the discovery, to the actual discovery of the unmarked graves. You revisit the history of the residential school. You speak to so many survivors, including former Williams Lake Chief Rick Gilbert and survivor investigator Charlene Belleau. How do you balance and I guess protect these people's emotional journey with these very difficult historic events?
So, I think that part of what was really special about this project for both Em and I is that we both come from very individual artistic and journalistic practices. But this was a project where, we brought our disparate skill sets. Em had been making films for so long. I have a long background in writing. And I think that those two ways in which we approach narrative and approach this art were really complementary. And I think that you could see that even in the structure of the documentary. On the one hand, it's an investigation, right? It follows a search for unmarked graves at a particular school. On the other hand, it's also an investigation into the lives of these four protagonists, right? My auntie Charlene Bellew, the late Chief Rick Gilbert, Chief Willie Sellers, and myself and my family. And I think that combined investigation of, both what's below ground and also what's above it from these schools was core to our shared skill sets and our shared vision of what Sugarcane could be, and it ended up working out.
Tell us more about how the land in Sugarcane really played a role in this film.
Well, firstly, we should say that Sugarcane is the name of the res.
Of the res, yes.
Yes, so Sugarcane is the name of the res that's just down Mission Road from St. Joseph's Mission. And, in Salish oral history and Salish ways of understanding and narrative, place is really essential. So who you are and your stories are always connected to the places that they come from. And we felt that not only was this a story rooted in a place, that being the Sugarcane Reserve primarily and the world of the Williams Lake First Nation and surrounding Secwepemc communities, but it's also one where the land itself, the territories of the Secwepemc and broader interior Salish peoples, which are gorgeous, deserve to have their own power and their own life at the same time as we needed to show that, that life itself has also been imperiled by legacies of colonial extraction, by legacies of what happened not just to Indigenous peoples, but also to the land itself.
Emily, what's the reception been like so far in Canada to the documentary?
Yeah, just to add one thing to the last one, I think what's important too is, and I didn't really know this, not having spent as much time in BC, but this is a Western town on the old Caribou Gold Rush Trail where there's, Williams Lake in the middle, and there's the settlement of Williams Lake, and there are cowboys on that side, and on the other side of the lake is the reservation, and there are Indigenous people, and then there are Indigenous cowboys, and that world and that landscape and the textures and tapestry of that are also in the DNA of this film and make it very special and specific to the land. In terms of the reception, I think the most heartening reception has been the one in Williams Lake itself. We showed it to over 800 people there, including hundreds of survivors who were so moved and saw themselves and felt heard, and it was a profoundly moving experience. And in the rest of Canada, I think the story is slowly catching on. We expect that there will always be a kind of more denialist movement or fatigue around the film and around the subject matter. But I think what we're hopeful is that this film will catalyze a conversation about how we're not at the truth yet. I think Canadians were very eager to get to the reconciliation part, but we believe that these communities at least are owed the truth. And those records have not fully been opened yet. And as we show in the film, and as we point to, there were crimes and instances of children being born at the school, being adopted out, other babies who were reported to have been found in the incinerator. These are truths that are just beginning to be unpacked and opened. And so it's important that Canadians are open to, and the government is ready to wrestle with the truth first.
And Julian, how are you hoping, I guess, what do you hope the legacy of this movie will be, but also this push for truth and to have this reckoning?
Well, firstly, I think people need to understand that this is one of the founding stories of this entire continent, not just here in Canada, but also in the United States, where there were 3 times as many Native American boarding schools as there were Indian residential schools in Canada. And there is no parallel reckoning in that country as there is here. And so I think it's really essential for people to understand that this is not just our history as Indigenous peoples. This is all of our collective history. And beyond that, I believe that while I'm skeptical, I think we are skeptical of the possibility for true reconciliation given this history between Indigenous peoples, the government, and the church. I do think it's really important for us as the survivors of this awful period in our shared history to reconcile with one another, to be honest about what these schools did to our families and to our communities, and to be able to forgive and find love for one another once again. Because if we don't have each other, if we don't have our community context, what are we left with?
Yeah. I want to thank you both for joining us and for putting forward just such an honest and deeply, deeply moving movie. And I hope that so many people watch it and connect with it. And Julian, I wish the best for you and your family in your journey towards healing.
Kukshem, it's been an honor to have a conversation with you.
Thank you to you both. Thank you, Emily.
Thanks for having me.
Julian Brave, Noisecat, director, and Emily Cassie, director, producer, and cinematographer. That was my conversation with the co-directors Julian Brave Noisecat and Emily Cassie. The film opens tonight at VIF Center and runs until September 1st.